Most people fail not because they lack talent, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack opportunity or resources or potential. They fail because they stop. They start with enthusiasm. They begin with energy and vision and big plans. But somewhere along the way, when the initial excitement fades, when the work becomes routine, when obstacles appear and progress seems slow, they stop showing up. They stop doing the work. They stop maintaining the habits that would eventually produce the results they want. And this stopping, this inability to maintain consistent action over time, this is what separates those who achieve lasting success from those who merely dream about it. You've seen this pattern. Perhaps you've lived it. You set a goal. You start strong. You work intensely for days or weeks. Then something disrupts your momentum. A busy period, an unexpected challenge, a moment of discouragement. And you tell yourself you'll get back to it. You'll resume when conditions improve, when motivation returns, when you feel ready again. But days become weeks, weeks become months, and what started with such promise becomes another abandoned effort, another unrealized intention, another confirmation that success is for others, not for you. But here's what you must understand. The difference between you and those who succeed is not talent or luck or circumstances. It's consistency. The simple, unglamorous, unsexy discipline of showing up and doing what needs doing day after day, whether you feel like it or not, whether conditions are favorable or not, whether you're motivated or not. This consistency, this ability to maintain effort over time regardless of how you feel, this is the foundation of every significant achievement. Not occasional bursts of intense effort, not sporadic work when inspiration strikes, but steady, persistent, consistent action maintained long enough for results to compound. And compound they will, because consistency is not just about maintaining effort. It's about harnessing the most powerful force in achievement, the force of accumulation, of small actions repeated until they produce large results, of habits maintained until they become automatic, of skills practiced until they become mastery. This force is available to everyone. It requires no special talent, no unique advantage, just the discipline to show up consistently and do the work when most people quit. And if you can develop this discipline, if you can force yourself to be consistent, even when every instinct tells you to stop, you gain an advantage that will carry you past obstacles that stop others. That will produce results that seem impossible to those who never learned to maintain consistent effort. Today, you're going to learn exactly how to develop this discipline. Not through motivation or inspiration, though those may come, but through understanding why consistency works, what destroys it, and how to maintain it when maintaining it is hardest. Because the ability to force yourself to be consistent, to override your resistance and maintain action over time, this is a skill. And like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, and mastered until it becomes your default way of operating. Until you become someone who simply doesn't quit, who shows up regardless of circumstances, who maintains effort until results appear. And when you become this person, when consistency becomes your character rather than just your strategy, success stops being a question of if and becomes a question of when. There's a principle that governs all achievement. A law as reliable as gravity. It states that consistent action over time produces compound results. This sounds simple, but most people never grasp its full implications. They understand compounding in finance. How money invested consistently over years grows exponentially through the power of compound interest. But they fail to recognize that the same principle applies to every area of life. Your skills compound, your knowledge compounds, your relationships compound, your reputation compounds, your habits compound. Everything you do consistently over sufficient time produces returns that far exceed the sum of the individual actions. Think about learning a language. The first day you study, you learn a few words. The return seems minimal. The second day, you add a few more words. Still minimal. But if you continue daily, if you study consistently for a year, you've accumulated thousands of words. You've trained your mind to think in patterns of this new language. You've developed a skill that seemed impossible when you started. not through any single heroic effort, but through the compound effect of small, consistent actions maintained over time. The same applies to wealth. $1 saved seems insignificant, but $1 saved daily becomes $365 yearly. Maintained for 10 years, invested wisely, it becomes far more through the compound returns of both your contributions and the growth they generate. Maintained for 30 years, it becomes substantial wealth, not through lottery winnings or lucky breaks, through the patient, consistent application of a simple principle over extended time. This is the power of consistency. It transforms the small into the significant, the ordinary into the extraordinary, the impossible into the inevitable, but only if maintained, only if you refuse to stop when progress seems slow, only if you trust the process long enough for compound effects to manifest. And this is where most people fail, not in understanding the principle, but in maintaining the action long enough for the principle to produce results. Because consistency is hard. It's boring. It lacks the excitement of new beginnings or the drama of intense effort. It's showing up on day 300 and doing the same work you did on day 1, even though results still seem distant. It's maintaining habits when no one is watching, when no one would know if you quit, when you could easily justify stopping. It's continuing to build when others have moved on to newer, sheenier pursuits. This unglamorous persistence, this quiet commitment to showing up regardless of how you feel, this is what creates lasting achievement. And this is what most people cannot sustain because they never learned how. They rely on motivation, on feeling inspired, on having energy and enthusiasm, and these are wonderful when present, but they're unreliable. Motivation comes and goes. Enthusiasm fades. Energy fluctuates. If you only act when you feel motivated, you'll act sporadically. And sporadic action produces sporadic results at best, usually nothing at all. Because the compound effect requires consistency. It requires action maintained over time without significant interruption. And maintaining action over time requires something more reliable than motivation. It requires discipline. The discipline to force yourself to act even when you don't feel like acting. To show up even when showing up is the last thing you want to do. To do the work even when the work feels pointless because results aren't yet visible. This discipline is not innate. It's not something you're born with or without. It's built, trained, developed through repeated practice of doing what you committed to do regardless of how you feel about it. Every time you show up when you don't want to, you strengthen this discipline. Every time you maintain your habit despite resistance, you build the capacity to maintain it next time. And over time, through hundreds and thousands of these small victories over your own resistance, the discipline becomes strong enough the consistency stops feeling like force and starts feeling natural, stops being something you must constantly fight for and becomes something you simply do. This is when achievement becomes inevitable, when you've trained yourself to be consistent regardless of circumstances or feelings. When showing up and doing the work has become so deeply ingrained that you do it automatically, the way you breathe, without thinking, without deciding, just doing. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Let me tell you about an ordinary person who achieved extraordinary results through nothing more than forced consistency maintained over time. There was a man who wanted to write, just to express ideas he'd been carrying for years. But he had a full-time job, a family, responsibilities, the usual obstacles everyone faces. He could have easily concluded he didn't have time, that writing was a luxury he couldn't afford, that he'd pursue it someday when life was less demanding. But he didn't. Instead, he made a decision he would write for 30 minutes every single morning, before work. Before the day's demands could interrupt, just 30 minutes, consistently. The first morning was exciting, new beginning, full of possibility. He wrote with enthusiasm, but the second morning was harder. He was tired, would have preferred to sleep longer. But he forced himself up, sat down, wrote. The third morning, doubt crept in. What he was writing felt mediocre. Was this even worth doing? But he wrote anyway. By the end of the first week, the novelty had completely worn off. Writing for 30 minutes felt more like obligation than opportunity. But he continued. This pattern repeated for months. Most days, he didn't feel like writing. Most days, what he wrote felt inadequate. Most days, he questioned whether this consistency was producing anything valuable. But he forced himself to maintain the habit, not because he felt motivated, but because he decided to be consistent. And he refused to break that commitment to himself. After 6 months, something shifted. The writing became easier. Not because he suddenly felt more motivated, but because the habit was now established. His mind knew that morning time was writing time. The resistance diminished. The words came more readily, and he'd accumulated nearly 100 pages of material. Not perfect material, but real, existing work that wouldn't exist if he'd waited for inspiration or perfect conditions. After a year, he'd written a complete manuscript, 250 pages, a book. Created entirely through 30-minute sessions maintained with boring consistency. He revised it. Published it independently. It sold moderately. Not a bestseller, but meaningful to the people who read it. And that success, modest as it was, came entirely from forced consistency, from showing up every morning for a year and doing the work whether he felt like it or not. But here's what's important. The book wasn't the real achievement. The real achievement was becoming someone who could maintain consistency. Because once you've proven to yourself that you can force consistent action in one area, you know you can do it in any area. The man went on to write more books, but he also applied the same principle to his health, to his finances, to his relationships. The skill of forced consistency, once developed, transfers, and it transforms everything. Now contrast this with another person, someone with more natural talent, better circumstances, more opportunities. This person also wanted to write, also had great ideas, but they waited for inspiration, waited for the right mood, waited for long blocks of uninterrupted time. They'd write intensely when inspiration struck, would produce pages in a burst of enthusiasm, then wouldn't write again for weeks, months. The effort was sporadic, inconsistent, and after a year they'd written perhaps 40 pages, less than the consistent person produced in 2 months. Why? Not because they were less talented, but because they never forced consistency. They only acted when they felt like it, and feeling like it was rare. This pattern is everywhere, in every field, in every endeavor. The consistent person with average talent outperforms the talented person with inconsistent effort. Always. Because talent without consistency is just potential, and potential without action remains forever unrealized. But consistency, even with modest talent, produces compound results, builds skills, creates momentum, generates outcomes. And over time, the consistent person doesn't just achieve more, they become more. The daily practice of their craft makes them skilled. The daily discipline makes them strong. The daily victories over resistance make them confident. Consistency doesn't just produce external results. It transforms who you are. So how do you develop this capacity? How do you train yourself to force consistency when every instinct says to stop? Let me show you what creates and sustains consistent action over time. First, you must understand that consistency is built on habits, not decisions. Every day you have to decide whether to do something is a day you might not do it, because decisions require mental energy, and mental energy is finite. If you wake up each morning and ask yourself whether you'll maintain your practice today, you're creating an opportunity for your mind to say no. But if you've built a habit, if the action is automatic, if you simply do it without deciding, consistency becomes effortless. Not easy necessarily, but effortless in the sense that you're not constantly fighting decision fatigue. This is why successful people have routines. Not because routines are inherently valuable, but because routines eliminate decisions. They create structure that makes consistency automatic. You wake at the same time. You do certain things in a certain order. You work during certain hours. You maintain certain practices at certain times. This structure removes the need to decide. You're not choosing whether to work out this morning. You work out every morning at 6. That's just what you do. No decision required. And without decision, without the mental battle of whether to maintain the practice, Consistency becomes your default. So if you want to force consistency, start by building routines. Identify the actions that will produce your desired results. Then schedule them, make them non-negotiable parts of your day, and execute them with machine-like regularity. Same time, same order, same commitment. Every single day, at first, this will require force. You'll have to override resistance, ignore excuses, push through reluctance. But if you maintain the routine long enough, it becomes habit. And once it's habit, it requires far less force. It's just what you do. But routines alone are not enough. You must also develop what I call self-command. This is the inner authority that allows you to direct yourself even when you don't want to be directed. Most people negotiate with themselves constantly. They have an internal dialogue about whether they should do what they committed to do, whether circumstances justify skipping today, whether they can start again tomorrow. This internal negotiation is deadly to consistency because you can always find reasons not to act, always justify one more delay, and each negotiation one makes the next negotiation easier, until you're someone who rarely follows through on anything. Self-command eliminates negotiation. When the time comes to act, you act, not because you feel like it, not because you've convinced yourself it's a good idea, but because you decided in advance that you would act, and you don't break commitments to yourself. This sounds simple, but it's extraordinarily difficult to develop because it requires treating yourself with the same seriousness you treat a critical commitment to someone else. If you'd committed to meet a client at 9, you'd be there at 9. No negotiation, no excuses. Self-command means treating commitments to yourself with the same gravity. You said you'd write for 30 minutes. You write for 30 minutes. You said you'd exercise, you exercise. No internal debate. No justification for skipping. You do what you said you'd do because your word to yourself matters. Developing this self-command requires practice. Start small. Make a commitment you know you can keep. Something simple. Then keep it absolutely, no exceptions. Build the pattern of doing what you said you'd do. Then gradually increase the difficulty of your commitments, but never break them. Never negotiate, never allow excuses, because every time you keep a commitment to yourself, you strengthen self-command. And every time you break one, you weaken it. Over time, through consistent keeping of commitments, self-command becomes strong enough to sustain any level of consistency required. Now, let me tell you something that most people resist hearing. Consistency maintained through self-command and routine will not feel good most of the time. It won't feel inspiring or motivating or exciting. Most days it will feel boring, mundane, like you're going through motions that lead nowhere. And this is exactly when consistency matters most. Anyone can maintain effort when results are visible, when progress is obvious, when motivation is high. But those conditions are rare. Most of the journey toward any significant goal is characterized by apparent lack of progress, by work that feels repetitive, by results that remain invisible. This is the test. This is where consistency separates achievers from dreamers. The achievers understand that invisible progress is still progress, that compound effects take time to manifest, that the work done during the boring middle, when results aren't visible, is actually the most important work, because this is when you're building the foundation, accumulating the small actions that will eventually produce large results. The dreamers quit during this period. They look at their effort and see nothing, so they conclude effort is wasted. But they're looking at the wrong time frame. They're expecting immediate returns from actions that produce compound returns. And compound returns by nature appear slowly, then suddenly. Nothing visible for extended periods. Then everything at once. So you must train yourself to trust the process during the invisible period. To maintain consistency when you see no evidence that consistency is working. This requires faith, not religious faith, but practical faith in the principle of compound action. The same faith you have that money saved consistently will eventually grow. The same faith you have that seeds planted will eventually sprout. You trust these processes even when you can't see results because you understand the principle. You must develop the same trust for your consistent actions. Trust that daily writing will eventually produce a completed work. That daily practice will eventually produce skill. That daily effort will eventually produce achievement. And this trust, maintained through the invisible period, is what allows consistency to continue long enough for results to manifest. But here's what destroys consistency for most people. Not lack of discipline necessarily, but distraction. The endless temptations to pursue something newer, shinier, that promises faster results. You're maintaining consistent action toward one goal. Progress is slow, invisible. Then you encounter information about a different approach, a faster method, a better opportunity, and you're tempted to abandon your current path and start fresh with this new thing. This seems logical, seems like adaptability, but it's actually the death of consistency, because you're resetting to zero, abandoning all the compound accumulation you'd built, and starting the invisible period over again with something new. This pattern, repeated across years, creates a life of constant beginning with no completion. The person who hops from opportunity to opportunity, method to method, never maintaining any single path long enough to see compound results, always looking for the shortcut that bypasses the necessity of consistency. And they wonder why success eludes them. They're working hard, trying different things, but they're never consistent, never maintaining effort in one direction long enough for momentum to build, for compound effects to manifest, for mastery to develop. So you must resist distraction, must commit to your chosen path and maintain that commitment long enough to see where it leads. Not forever necessarily, but long enough to give compound action time to work. This might be 6 months, a year, 2 years, depends on what you're building. But it must be long enough that you're not constantly starting over, not constantly resetting to zero, because achievement requires accumulation, and accumulation requires sustained focus on one direction over extended time. Now, even with habits established, self-command developed, faith in the process maintained, and distractions resisted, there will still be moments when consistency breaks, when life interrupts, when circumstances make it genuinely impossible to maintain your practice. A crisis, a major disruption. These moments are inevitable, and they're not failure. The question is not whether you'll have interruptions. The question is how quickly you resume after interruption. Most people, when consistency breaks, treat it as permission to quit entirely. They miss one day and conclude they've failed, so they abandon the entire practice. Or they take a break that extends indefinitely because they can't find the perfect moment to restart. But this is catastrophic to long-term consistency, because life will always interrupt, always present obstacles, always create circumstances that disrupt routine. If every disruption becomes a reason to quit, you'll never maintain anything long enough to succeed. Instead, you must develop the skill of immediate resumption. When consistency breaks, you resume immediately. Not when conditions are perfect, not when you feel ready. Immediately. Miss your morning routine because of an emergency. Resume tomorrow morning. No gap, no extended break. Just immediate return to the practice. This immediate resumption prevents the psychological pattern where one missed day becomes a week, then a month, then permanent abandonment. It treats breaks as temporary deviations rather than permanent endings. And this treatment makes consistency sustainable over years and decades rather than just weeks and months. Think of consistency as a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. The longer you maintain consistent action, the easier maintaining becomes. Not easy, easier, because you've trained the capacity, built the habits, developed the self-command, established the routines. And all of this infrastructure supports consistency, even when motivation is absent, even when progress seems slow, even when circumstances are challenging. You become someone who simply doesn't quit, who shows up regardless, who maintains effort until results appear. And when you become this person, when consistency is woven into your character, rather than just your current strategy, you gain access to outcomes that remain forever out of reach for those who never learned to force themselves to be consistent. But here's something profound that most people never realize. Forcing consistency is not about rigid willpower alone. It's not about grinding through misery. It's about creating internal systems that make consistency the path of least resistance. It's about structuring your life, your environment, your habits, your thinking in ways that support sustained action rather than undermine it. This is the subtle art of consistency, not just pushing harder, but creating conditions where maintaining effort feels natural rather than forced. Think about environment first. Your physical environment either supports consistency or sabotages it. If you want to write consistently, but your desk is cluttered with distractions, you're fighting your environment every time you try to write. If you want to exercise consistently, but your workout clothes are buried in a closet, you're adding friction to the action you're trying to maintain. But if you structure your environment to support your consistent actions, if you remove obstacles and create easy access to what you want to do, consistency becomes easier. The writer who wants to maintain daily practice should have a dedicated space for writing, clear of distractions, set up and ready. So sitting down to write requires minimal effort. The person who wants to exercise consistently should prepare workout clothes the night before, should have equipment accessible, should eliminate any friction between intention and action. These seem like small things, but consistency is destroyed by small frictions accumulated over time, and it's supported by small facilitations accumulated over time. So you must deliberately structure environment to make consistent action easier than inconsistent action. Your mental environment matters just as much. The thoughts you think about your practice, the stories you tell yourself about your consistency. These either support or undermine sustained effort. If you think of your daily practice as burden, as sacrifice, as something you have to do, you're creating internal resistance. But if you reframe it as opportunity, as investment, as something you get to do, the resistance diminishes, not through self-deception, but through accurate perspective. You do get to pursue your goals. You do get to build something meaningful. You do get to develop yourself through consistent action. This is privilege, not burden. And recognizing it as privilege makes consistency feel less like force and more like choice. Your social environment influences consistency as well. The people you surround yourself with either support your commitment to consistent action or they sabotage it through their own lack of discipline. If everyone around you quits when things get hard, you'll find it harder to persist when you want to quit. But if you're surrounded by people who value consistency, who maintain their commitments, who show up regardless of how they feel, their example reinforces your own discipline. So you must be selective about who you spend time with, not in a cold or calculating way, but in recognition that consistency is contagious, both consistency and inconsistency, and you'll tend toward the pattern that dominates your social environment. But even with optimal environment, even with supportive thoughts and people, consistency still requires something internal, something that no external structure can fully replace. It requires the decision to value long-term results over short-term comfort. This is the fundamental trade that consistency demands. You give up the comfort of doing what you feel like doing in any given moment, and in exchange, you gain the results that only sustained effort can produce. Most people are unwilling to make this trade. They optimize for feeling good now rather than being successful later. They choose immediate comfort over delayed achievement. And this choice, repeated daily, creates a life of comfort with no accomplishment. But you can choose differently. You can decide that the discomfort of forcing consistency is worth the results that consistency produces. That showing up when you don't want to is worth the compound effects of showing up over time. That sacrificing short-term ease is worth long-term achievement. This decision, made consciously and reinforced daily, changes everything, because now you have a filter for every moment. Does this action serve my long-term results or my short-term comfort? And you consistently choose results over comfort, not because you're miserable, but because you value the destination more than the ease of the journey. This doesn't mean never resting, never enjoying comfort, but it means those things are strategic choices rather than default responses. You rest intentionally to support long-term consistency. You enjoy comfort after maintaining your commitments. But you don't let comfort prevent consistency. Don't let ease derail effort. Don't let short-term preference override long-term priority. And through this consistent choosing of long-term over short-term, you build a life that most people only dream about. Because most people remain trapped in short-term thinking, trapped in the pursuit of immediate comfort, never willing to sacrifice today for tomorrow. And so tomorrow never becomes what they hoped it would be. Your path is different. Your path is forcing consistency even when consistency is uncomfortable, even when results are invisible, even when motivation is absent, even when circumstances are challenging. You show up, you do the work, you maintain the practices, you keep the commitments, day after day after day. Not because each individual day feels significant, but because you understand that these individual days, accumulated over time, create outcomes that seem impossible to those who never learn to maintain consistent effort. And here's what happens, not immediately, but inevitably. The compound effects begin to manifest. The skills you've been practicing become capabilities. The work you've been maintaining becomes achievement. The habits you've been forcing become character. You become someone different, someone who can be counted on, someone who finishes what they start, someone who maintains effort until results appear. And this transformation, this shift from someone who tries into someone who achieves, this is the real gift of forced consistency. Not just what you accomplish, but who you become through the process of accomplishing it. So let me tell you how to begin. How to start building the capacity for forced consistency starting today. Not through dramatic overhaul, through simple, sustainable practices maintained over time. Choose one area of your life where you want to create change, just one. Not 5, not 3. One, maybe it's health, maybe it's wealth, maybe it's skill development. Whatever area would benefit most from consistent attention, choose that. Then identify one small action you can take daily in that area. Something simple enough that you could do it even on your worst day. Not the optimal action, the minimum viable action. If it's health, maybe it's 10 minutes of movement. If it's wealth, maybe it's reviewing your finances for 5 minutes. If it's skill, maybe it's 15 minutes of practice. Small. Achievable, then commit to that action for 30 days. Not forever, just 30 days. And execute it with absolute consistency, every single day, same time if possible. No exceptions, no negotiations. No matter how you feel, you do it. This 30-day period is not about producing dramatic results. It's about proving to yourself that you can force consistency, that you can maintain a commitment regardless of how you feel. And when you complete 30 days, when you've shown up every single day and done what you said you'd do, something shifts. You have evidence that you can be consistent, and that evidence builds confidence in your capacity to maintain any level of consistency required. After 30 days, continue the practice. Don't stop just because the commitment period ended, but now add another small consistent action. Something that supports the same goal or addresses a different area, and maintain both consistently for another 30 days. Then add a third. Gradually, through this stacking of small, consistent actions, you build a life that's structured entirely around practices that produce compound results. And as these practices accumulate, as they become your natural way of operating, you transform from someone who struggles with consistency into someone who embodies consistency, for whom showing up and doing the work is not a constant battle, but simply who you are. Throughout this process, track your consistency, not obsessively, but visibly. A simple calendar where you mark each day you maintain your practice. This visual record serves two purposes. First, it creates accountability. You can see immediately whether you're being consistent or not. No self-deception. No vague sense that you're probably doing okay. Just clear evidence. Second, it builds momentum. When you see a streak of days accumulating, you become motivated to not break the streak. Not because streaks matter inherently, but because they represent your consistency, your commitment, your character. And protecting that becomes more important than the temporary comfort of skipping. Also, expect resistance. Expect your mind to generate excuses, to suggest exceptions, to argue that today doesn't count. This is normal. Your mind is accustomed to short-term thinking, to prioritizing immediate comfort, so it will resist the discomfort of forced consistency. But you must not negotiate, must not listen to the excuses, must simply acknowledge the resistance and act anyway. This is the core practice, not waiting until resistance disappears, but acting despite resistance. And the more you practice acting despite resistance, the weaker resistance becomes, until eventually you act without significant resistance at all, because you've trained your mind that resistance doesn't determine action. Commitment does. And when you fail, because you will fail occasionally, when you break consistency, don't spiral into judgment or abandonment. Simply resume immediately, the very next day, the very next opportunity. No gap, no punishment, no self-criticism. Just calm, immediate resumption, because the skill is not never breaking consistency. The skill is resuming immediately when consistency breaks. And that skill, that immediate resumption, is what allows consistency to survive over years and decades despite inevitable disruptions. You are building something here, not just working toward goals, building character, building the capacity to force yourself to do what needs doing regardless of circumstance or feeling. This capacity, once built, transfers to everything, to your relationships, to your career, to your health, to your finances, to every area where sustained effort produces compound results. You become someone who can be trusted with responsibility because you maintain commitment, someone who achieves goals because you persist until achievement, someone who builds wealth because you save consistently, someone who develops skill because you practice daily. Consistency becomes the multiplier that makes everything else work. And the beautiful thing is this: consistency is entirely within your control. You cannot control outcomes directly, cannot guarantee that effort will produce specific results. But you can control consistency, can decide to show up, can choose to do the work, can maintain the practices. This you control completely. And by controlling the one thing you can control, by forcing yourself to be consistent regardless of circumstances, you maximize the probability of every outcome you desire. Not guarantee, but maximize probability. And probability, leveraged through consistency over sufficient time, produces results that seem like certainty to those who maintain the effort. This is your path, not hoping for motivation, not waiting for perfect conditions, not depending on luck or talent or advantages, but forcing consistency, showing up, doing the work, maintaining the practices, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, until the compound effects become undeniable, until the person you've been becoming through consistent action is unrecognizable from the person who started, until the results you've been building through consistent effort exceed what seemed possible when you began. Lasting success is not dramatic. It's not sudden. It's not the result of single heroic efforts or lucky breaks. It's earned quietly through repeated action maintained over time, through consistency that most people cannot sustain because they never learned that consistency is not about feeling motivated. It's about forcing action regardless of feeling, about showing up regardless of circumstance, about maintaining commitment regardless of visible progress. This is the discipline that creates every meaningful achievement. This is the foundation beneath every lasting success. This is the difference between those who realize their potential and those who merely possess potential. Force yourself to be consistent, not someday. Starting now, with one small action maintained absolutely, and discover that you're capable of far more than you believed, that the compound effects of consistency, given sufficient time, produce results that seem miraculous to those who never maintained consistency long enough to experience them. But to you, they'll be the natural, inevitable outcome of deciding to show up and maintain effort regardless of obstacle, regardless of feeling, regardless of visible progress, until consistency is not something you force, but something you are